Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD bodybuilder, back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about how to squat, bench, and deadlift for muscle growth. The squat, bench press, and deadlift are three of the most popular movements used in strength sports. And there's a lot of controversy on the internet about how to use them properly for strength and for muscle growth. So today we're going to zoom in on the hypertrophy angle of things, and we'll give you some pointers on how to program these movements optimally for bodybuilding. So really for people who are focused on aesthetics or maximum muscle growth. Quick outline for today, we're going to be talking about some general programming strategies that will apply to all three of these movements, and then we'll also talk about exercise specific tips. If you've been enjoying my content so far, make sure you like the video, hit subscribe, and let's get right into it. Now starting off, it's really important that you progressively overload these movements because this is probably the best indicator that you're actually making gains. My stance on progressive overload for these movements is to increase your multi-set 6 to 10 rep max as quickly as possible in a sustainable way. Now, what do I mean by this? For background, check out my video on progressive overload techniques, but basically what this means is you want to be increasing how much weight you can lift in the 6 to 10 rep range over multiple sets. And you want to do this as quickly as possible in a sustainable way. Obviously, the faster you're able to progress, the better gains you're going to make. But you also want to be doing this sustainably. The rate at which you're able to progressively overload will depend on your experience level. For absolute beginners and people sort of in their first year of training, they can often add weight up to every workout. And if you're able to do so, you absolutely should. Intermediates will be able to add weight every week to every month or so, and people who are more advanced might add weight every month or longer. You'll want to be overloading at a rate that's really sustainable over months at a time. If you're trying to add weight every workout and end up stalling in a couple of weeks, you're probably not doing it right. And there's no point in grinding yourself to the ground trying to add that extra weight because it's just going to generate a lot of fatigue and get in the way of hypertrophy. All right, next most important variable is volume. So the key thing about bodybuilding is you want to be focusing on maximizing the amount of productive volume that you're doing. The key with volume is finding the sweet spot. You don't want to be doing too much or too little, and the optimal amount of volume will depend on your training level as well as individual factors. What that means is, and there's a big mistake that comes in here when people program their squat, bench, and deadlift, is that people follow these cookie cutter programs like 5x5 where you're given a fixed number of sets that you always do. The problem with this is it doesn't take into account your individual factors. So you're really going to have to play with volume over time to find what works best for you. I'd recommend starting low and gradually adding in sets. And you're going to add in sets to find the volume that produces the fastest progress for you. And to gauge progress, just use my metrics for progressive overload that we just talked about. Remember that the relationship between volume and hypertrophy is an inverted U-shaped curve. The curve looks like this. If the y-axis is your rate of gains, and your x-axis is the number of sets you're doing, if you do too few sets, you're not going to make gains. If you do too many sets, you're also not going to make gains. So the key is to try and find that sweet spot in the middle where you're doing just the right number of sets to give you the maximum rate of progress. All right, let's talk about intensity and rep ranges. So how much weight should you be lifting and for how many reps? Now, before I get into this, you'll notice that my recommendations in this video are going to be slightly different than my general recommendations that I talk about in my Basics of Training series because the application of these training variables differs depending on the exercise as well as the muscle group. The squat, bench, and deadlift are somewhat unique because they allow you to lift a lot of weight and also generate a lot of fatigue. So getting into this, my favorite rep range for the big three movements is usually 5 to 10 reps. Squat, bench, and deadlift allow you to move a lot of weight and generate a lot of fatigue. So going under 5 reps tends to produce a disproportionate amount of fatigue for the amount of productive volume that you're getting in. If you work it out looking at volume in terms of sets times reps times weight lifted, you'll find that doing low rep sets like triples is not going to be productive in terms of the amount of volume you're able to produce compared to going say 5 to 8 reps. Going over 10 reps is fine, but it produces a lot of metabolic burn, and I think most people will find that it's just very psychologically demanding. In terms of relative intensity or how close you go to failure, I go for a reps in reserve count of 1 to 4. This is a little looser than my general recommendation of training to 1 to 2 reps shy of failure. And the reason is these big movements allow you to move a lot of weight. So you get a lot of stimulus even if you're a little bit farther away from failure. On top of that, you don't want to be pushing too close to failure on these because they'll generate a disproportionate amount of fatigue, and it will really affect the following exercises in your workout and end up reducing your productivity overall. Now, a couple of other pointers while we're talking about intensity and rep ranges. Don't fail reps. So when we talk about reps in reserve, you shouldn't be going to failure on these big three movements because you produce a lot of fatigue and you're also going to be at a high injury risk. The other thing I would say is don't test 1RMs. Your 1 rep max strength really doesn't translate that well into hypertrophy, and you're better off just tracking your progress over the 5 to 10 rep range over time. As long as you're building strength in that rep range over multiple sets, you're going to be building muscle. All right, now let's go into some specific tips for the squat, bench, and deadlift themselves. Now in terms of the squat, for some technique tips, you're going to want to maximize your range of motion, because when you use more range of motion, you're going to get more stimulus for the amount of fatigue you produce. I'd recommend squatting minimum to parallel or as low as possible while keeping a neutral spine. Now in terms of some variations of the squat, they're all great, but they do have some specific differences that we'll talk about here. 3 common variations are low bar squat, high bar squat, and the front squat. The high bar squat is probably the most basic one, where the weight is balanced on your upper traps. In a low bar squat, the barbell sits lower down on your rear delts. And in a front squat, the barbell is in front of your shoulders. Now these variations have different properties in terms of the amount of weight you can lift, the amount of fatigue they produce, the amount of stimulation you get on your quads, as well as in your glutes and lower back. Now note here that as a general trend, when you're able to lift more weight with a movement, that's also going to produce more systemic fatigue, which does become an issue for people who are intermediate or advanced, because if you produce too much fatigue, you're going to limit the amount of productive volume that you're able to get done within a workout across a training week or across a training block. Now, in terms of the amount of weight you're lifting, low bar squat tends to allow you to move the most weight, but also produces the most fatigue. High bar squat produces slightly less, and front squat usually allows you to move the least amount of weight but produces less fatigue. Now in terms of the stimulation you get in your quads, the front squat tends to produce the most quad stimulation, followed by high bar squats and then low bar squats. And in terms of the amount of stimulation you get for your glutes and your lower back, it's the reverse. So top would be low bar squat, then high bar squat, and front squat. Now I have no problem with these movements, but I think if you're an advanced athlete, I would actually steer away from the low bar squat just because of the amount of fatigue you're producing. All right, now let's move on to some tips for the bench press. First off, range of motion. You should really try to touch your chest with the barbell with every rep. This actually does 2 things. First of all, you maximize your range of motion so you get the most stimulus out of every rep for the amount of weight you're lifting. Second, it makes reps very reproducible. So you know that if you're able to add a rep or add some weight, you're really progressively overloading and building muscle. In terms of grip width, if you're using bench to train your chest, I would just go with whatever feels best. And if you're doing close grip bench for your triceps, I'd recommend going around shoulder width. You can go more narrow than that, but just keep in mind that it'll put more stress on your wrists, and if it's causing you pain, you'll want to move away from that. All right, lastly, let's talk about the deadlift. Now, in terms of technique tips, first of all, keep a neutral spine. I don't want to see anyone bending their spine while deadlifting. Next, try not to bounce the weight, because you're going to cheat yourself with a range of motion at the bottom of the lift and you'll lose out on some of that hypertrophic stimulus. Lastly, if your goal is muscle growth, straps are fine. You're really using this movement to train the big muscles in your body and not your forearms. In terms of variations of the deadlift, I think the 2 main ones we'll talk about are sumo deadlift and conventional. Sumo deadlifts are where your knees are outside your arms when you're lifting, and in conventional deadlifts, your knees are in between your arms. In terms of which one allows you to move more weight, this actually depends on the person, because it depends on your body dimensions. So try it out for yourself. In terms of fatigue, conventional deadlifts tend to produce more fatigue. In terms of training the lower back, conventional deadlifts win out here. And for training the legs, sumo deadlifts generally produce more stimulus. Which one you actually go with is up to you, and there's a lot of controversy out there of whether you should put deadlifts on leg day or back day. I personally like using sumo deadlifts because you get a little bit less fatigue, and it's easier to program these for lower body days. Conventional deadlifts do put a lot of stress on the back, so it could interfere with your back training. Now lastly, for deadlifts, I would actually generally recommend against using them for advanced bodybuilders. This is controversial, but in my opinion, for really advanced bodybuilders, they're able to lift so much weight with deadlifts that it just produces too much fatigue for the amount of stimulus that they're getting. This is a little bit of a judgment call, and I think when I'm talking about advanced, I mean you're lifting more than 400 pounds for reps. But if you find that managing fatigue is a big issue for you, you might want to avoid deadlifting from the ground. Now, if you really want to take your training to the next level, check out my book where I give you some sample programs based on the upper-lower split and teach you how to modify your own program to get the best results. That's all for now, guys. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like the video and leave me a comment below. I'm really good about answering every single one of my comments, so you'll definitely hear back from me. In particular, do you squat, bench, and deadlift in your program? And if not, why? Let me know below. If you're curious about what progression scheme is the best to actually add weight over time on these major lifts, check out my video on progressive overload where I talk about different progression schemes for bodybuilding. If you're getting value from my channel, make sure you subscribe and share the channel with your fitness friends so they can benefit from it too. See you next time.